Hey everybody, Brett from AstartesGaming here, back with another Mountain Blade 2 Bannerlord video. This is the map comparison and faction overview video that I've promised you guys. Way back I made another video, essentially the same thing, but with far less information to go on. And so this video is going to serve as a revision to that video. You don't need to go back and watch that to pick up on anything here. I'm going to cover everything that I covered in that video, just with more up-to-date information. So with that, let's go ahead and dive on in. Actually, before we do that, I want to apologize in advance if you can hear my fan rattling in the background. It has been incredibly hot lately, so I have it running full blast. You may hear it, you may not, but in case you do, sorry about that. So anyways, a lot has happened since that last video. It's been, I think, almost like 2 years at this point, and the developers have released several developer blogs since that have given us quite a bit more information, not just on the overall game, but on the factions and their lore in detail. So we're going to cover a lot of that here. Alright, so with that, let's go ahead and dive on in. We're going to start with the map. So this is Warband as we knew it. This is CALRADIA as it used to be. We have the Nords up top, Vagirs to the northeast, the Kurgit or Kurgit, however you prefer to pronounce that, to the east, Rhodoks and Swadia to the west, and the Serenids to the south. And so if we look at that same map but with the new factions, we get something that looks sort of like this. They actually spill off the map, and we'll see why in a bit. But most of the west is taken up by the VLANDIANS. The Empire takes up pretty much the entirety of the southeast and most of the east. The BATTANIANS kind of sneak into the middle, and the STURGIANS occupy the entire north. So let's go ahead and look at the actual Bannerlord map and get a better idea of how this works. So here we can see the full map, and it's quite a bit bigger than CALRADIA as we've seen it before. The Empire is going to occupy the vast majority of the territory in the center of the map, and it's actually split into three, as you'll see there. So we have Western, Northern, and Southern. I've also seen that one referred to as Eastern, so, you know, either way, Southern or Eastern. I'm just going to refer to it as Southern here, but, you know, call it what you like. Anyway, we have the KHUZAITS sort of along the eastern fringe, the VLANDIANS occupying the entirety of the west. Again, the BATTANIANS just kind of wedged in between everybody else. The STURGIANS along the north, and the ASERAI occupying the entire south. So to get an idea of the scale of this map, let's go ahead and apply Warband's map over the top of it. So if we do that, we get something that looks like this. Now, I did this in that previous video and got a lot of criticism for this. There were people that said, well, you can't just, you know, apply it right over the top. It doesn't really account for like scale or anything. But this is essentially what the developers did. Of course, the people that were making that criticism didn't know what they were talking about. They didn't do their homework. Because here is the exact quote from Tailworlds. So in Developer Blog 12, they talk about a lot of things, but one of which is the scale of the map. So here's what they say. Bannerlord shares the setting of CALRADIA with Warband, but takes place 200 years earlier. For those of you who don't know, by the way, Warband takes inspiration from roughly 13 to maybe 14 AD, give or take, like maybe 100 years on either side of that. Bannerlord is taking inspiration from roughly 1000 AD, with, again, about 100 years, give or take, on either end of that. So in both cases, we're dealing with, like, medieval history, and not, like, you know, classical history or anything like that. So those people who were expecting like a true, like, you know, Roman Empire are going to be a bit disappointed. But anyways, that's, you know, for a different video. So the map is also expanded to include regions further to the east and south. So again, everything is being expanded to the east and south of that in the previous games, resulting in a map which is around 3 times larger. So the map is 3 times larger than the Warband map. And sure enough, if we do the math, we'll see that this particular area here, so I took a 1280 by 720 image of the Bannerlord map, which is what you're seeing in the background there. I applied the Warband map over it. It was 630 across by 470 tall. These are in pixels, just, some, as long as they're relative, it doesn't matter what the units are, they just need to be consistent. So if we measure the areas of those, we see that it is roughly 3 times larger. Obviously, there is a bit of excess on either side and to the top as well. So whether or not they count that, we don't know. But even if you shave that off, you're looking at still well over 2 times larger. So I'm going to assume that they're either taking it exactly as this or roughly around thereabouts. So yes, we can see that if we do this, we get a rough approximation of exactly how much bigger the Bannerlord map will be. Now, do take this with a grain of salt, because we know from a recent developer blog that the Bannerlord world map is being redone. Whether or not the scale will change, we don't know. Whether or not all the cities and stuff will change, we don't know. All we know that it's being revamped. So there's that. Anyways, moving on. We are going to go ahead and jump into the factions now, and we're going to do these roughly in the order that their developer blogs were posted. It may not be exact, but it'll be close enough. Either way, we're going to start with the BATTANIANS. And so the BATTANIANS have no association with any of the factions that we are familiar with from Warband. There has been speculation, by myself included, that they might be somewhat related to the forest bandits that we find in Warband. They run in similar areas and they use similar equipment. But aside from that, there's no real ties to anything in Warband, so we have no connections there. They're inspired by various Celtic groups, one of which is the Welsh, because they do love their longbows. And generally longbows are associated with first the Welsh, then the English in later periods, but have been found to be used well before that by other groups of people throughout history, although maybe not as prevalently. Anyways, we do find inspiration from several Celtic groups. There is definitely a lot of inspiration pulled from the Irish, especially in some of the melee infantry that we see. They also, or the developers anyways, claim that there's some Pictish influence. It might be through the Berserker type unit that they have. The historical basis behind that, I couldn't quite vouch for. We also know that they, at least in some gameplay videos, have used falks as weapons. Falks being sort of like a curved, almost like if you took a scythe and made it into a sword type of thing. It's difficult to describe, but if you Google it, you'll get plenty of pictures. And those were generally, throughout history, Thracian or Dacian weapons. And so you could sort of kind of lump them into the Celtic group, although the developers say that they were particularly focused on Western Celtic groups, and the Thracians and Dacians were Eastern, somewhere around like modern-day Romania or thereabouts. So there is that. Anyways, they occupy the northwest part of the map in that little territory that we saw previously. So they're very much surrounded. They have the Empire on like 2 fronts, the VLANDIANS on a 3rd, and the STURGIANS on a 4th. So they're very much the underdogs of this game, and I think that does make them quite an interesting faction. I think a lot of people are interested in them, not just because they have a very cool aesthetic to them, but also because of the challenges they present. So they are led by King CALRADIANS, and he is said to be a pretty interesting character, being kind of ruthless and cunning, but with a very sharp sense of humor. And so it'll be interesting to see how that materializes in game. As I mentioned before, they specialize in longbowmen. That is their primary focus. They, of course, have a variety of units. Every faction in this game will have cavalry. Unlike in Warband, there's no faction like the Nords that is completely focused on, foot slogging it across the battlefield. Everybody has at least some form of mounted troop. So these guys will deploy cavalry. They will deploy infantry, albeit a little bit lighter than some of the other factions, so that is something to keep in mind. They prefer hit and run tactics. Whether or not you'll be able to sustain that during a war is, going to remain to be seen. And finally, We are aware of one of their minor factions. They may have more, but unfortunately the developer blogs are a bit inconsistent as to the information they provide. Some developer blogs mention several minor factions within a faction, presumably all of them, and some of them just give an example. So here we have the Wolfskins, which are based on the Irish Fianna, or Fianna, depending on how you would like to pronounce that. Those are probably both wrong, but you get the idea. However, they've given it a bit of a fantasy twist in that these guys have a code of the wolf, where they are sort of beholden to themselves to live as animals. They only eat raw meat. They don't live under roofs. And so long as they hold to this rule or set of rules, they aren't beholden to the laws of men. And so they are kind of just like this mercenary group, not necessarily good in intent, but not entirely bad. Regarding the minor factions, it's not 100% clear as to whether or not you'll be able to join them yourself, either as an individual troop or leading their armies, but we definitely don't know that you can interact with them in some capacity. So hopefully you will actually be able to join these guys either as a soldier or a general and lead their armies, because there are some very interesting minor factions that it seems like it would be fun to play as, if whether as a full playthrough or as just part of a larger one. So moving on, we go to the KHUZAITS, who are a precursor to the Kurgate, whatever. And so, as you might expect, they are the horse archer faction. So they're inspired by the Mongols, the Avars, and several other steppe tribes from roughly that time period. Attila the Hun and the Huns are a little bit too early, but I'm sure if you looked hard enough, you could find some of their influence in there as well. They're going to occupy, again, that eastern fringe of the map. And they were formerly led by Erkun the KHUZAIT. Now, they never explicitly state who the current leader is. The faction does seem to be in a little bit of disarray at the moment. Erkun was essentially their Attila, their Genghis Khan. He united all the tribes and led a great conquest, and now that he is dead, the faction seems to be somewhat divided. So it's not clear as to whether in-game they will have one leader that everybody sort of falls underneath, or if they'll be sort of led by several high-ups, but no one person in particular. So that will be interesting to see. But again, they don't explicitly state any one leader other than the previous one, who is now dead. It does say that his descendants are the leaders, though. So maybe he had several sons and each one leads a sub-faction. I can't say. Anyways, they of course specialize in mounted troops, particularly mounted archers. The AI for mounted archers is said to be completely revamped and improved, so we can only hope that is the case, because obviously in Warband, horse archery was particularly powerful for the player, but horse archer troops were generally dumb and not very good at anything. The Kurgits were very bad in a lot of scenarios. They were annoying to deal with. I mean, don't get me wrong, they were difficult to fight because they were difficult to catch, but they couldn't hold any of their territory, and so that led to them being one of the factions that typically got wiped out fairly early, unless the player intervened on their behalf. Tailworlds has said that they're going to take several steps to make sure that's no longer the case. There are new siege mechanics that allow you to not ignore sieges, but rather than fight a siege battle, actually sally out and fight on the battlefield, which for a army that's entirely mounted is obviously advantageous to fighting at the walls where the horses don't count for anything. So that should help them in that regard. And then of course, as I already said, the improved AI should keep them from getting caught on trees and generally running into masses of infantry when they should be circling them. They only have one minor faction that we're aware of, called the KHUZAITS, and they are sort of a fundamentalist nomadic group within the KHUZAITS. They are adamant about sticking to the old ways, and so they are more raider than like peaceful tribe, although the KHUZAITS in general aren't exactly a peaceful tribe, but they are more settled than the KHUZAITS are, or would prefer to be. So that's pretty much all we know about them. Moving on to the next one, we have the STURGIANS, and this is a particularly interesting group because it's actually sort of a fusion of two factions that we're familiar with from Warband, but really tied to one of them, and that's the Vaegirs. So they're actually the precursor to the Vaegirs, at least from all the information that we have. And we know this because they're heavily inspired by Kievan Rus. Now, if you're not familiar with Kievan Rus, this is like pre-Russian, sort of like Russian medieval history. So it's in, geographical Russia, but it wasn't Russia yet. I don't want to get too much into it because, this is like a entire history class's worth of information that could be covered. But essentially, Rus was Slavic peoples being ruled by Scandinavians, or like Vikings that had come from Scandinavia, and so they intermixed, and you have this group of people. So applying that to CALRADIA, we have whatever group was the descendants of the Vaegirs, plus what we can assume were the descendants of, or the ancestors of, the Nords coming over. Now, the Nords are still off to the north. They're not part of Bannerlord, but we can only assume that some of them came down, intermixed with whoever was originally in this group, and we now have the STURGIANS. So they occupy the northern part of the map. There is more like northern territory that's all snow above them and to the west of them, but for the most part of CALRADIA, they're occupying the north. And they are led by Prince Ragnvald, which looks a lot like Rainwald, but I'm not going to assume spelling or pronunciation on any of this stuff because it's all made up names in fantasy settings. Anyways, these guys are focused on heavy infantry for the most part, but as I said earlier, they still will have cavalry. They also do have pretty decent archers. They're fairly well balanced, but they are more offensive than defensive. So all in all, they play very similar to Vaegirs from Warband, although probably with slightly less cavalry focus and more infantry focus. They have two minor factions that we know of. One is the Skolder who are they are based on a particular group, and I can't recall the name, but a particular group of Viking raider mercenaries that were very religious in their worship of like Thor and Odin, and they served as sort of like, I've seen them compared to some of the earlier knightly orders, but with the Norse paganism rather than Christianity. And they were operating out of like coastal Poland, which is very interesting. Anyways, if you're interested in like a more Viking-y, raidery sub-faction to join, they might be the way for you to go. And then the Sons of the Forest are based on Finnish forest nomads. And so they seem like they're going to sort of tread a little bit on the Battanian territory, but we'll see. I'm not sure what's going to set them apart, but they might just be there to kind of complement the heavy infantry of the rest of the faction. So maybe they'll supply the archers. I can't say for sure, but it seems like they've got some interesting sub-factions that might be worth looking at. So on to the next group, we have the VLANDIANS. These guys, of course, are the precursors to the SWATians. More than likely, they're the precursor to the Rhodoks as well. Because as we saw on the map, and I'll pull that back up so you guys can see it, the VLANDIANS occupy the territory that both of those factions will come to occupy in Warband. So the assumption is that this faction eventually split, because we do know that the Kingdom of Rhodoks split from the Kingdom of Swatia. and left them as two separate factions. So again, the assumption is that the VLANDIANS were that previous united faction, and then when they split, they became Rhodoks and Swadia. Now, the reason why we can assume that they're part of the or they're related to Rhodoks is because in their blog post we actually see some pictures of their units, and some of them are very reminiscent of Rhodoks. Of course, some of them are very reminiscent of Swadia, so it looks like they've just merged the two. But that's why we can essentially throw out any idea that the Battanians were related to Rhodoks. The territory isn't right. The focuses are completely off. Yes, they both like ranged troops, but one is entirely dedicated to longbows, the other is entirely dedicated to crossbows. It just doesn't quite add up. So anyways, focusing back on the VLANDIANS, they're inspired by the Normans, which, if you're not familiar with the Normans, pretty interesting story there. If you've watched the show Vikings, Rollo, although that show is not very historically accurate, Rollo, when he sort of landed in West Francia and was given after several events, given a sort of like a title there, he essentially formed what became Normandy and the Normans. And so the Normans are Viking descendants in West Francia, eventually France, and they eventually conquered Britain under William the Conqueror, and many of the earlier English kings, like William the Conqueror and even up to Richard the Lionheart, were Norman, and so many of them didn't even speak English, they spoke French. But yes, the Normans were a very interesting group. They loved their mounted cavalry charges with lances, and so they occupy the western part of the map, as we saw. Their leader is King Durthert, who, as the developer blogs tell us, is a bit world weary, is how they put it. So I assume he's going to be a little bit older, kind of tired, not super invested in what's going on, and the faction is said to be kind of divided, with all of the lords more invested in what's going on with themselves than what's going on with the kingdom as a whole. So it seems like this faction could be very easily split, and maybe this is right before they split into Swadia and Rhodoks. Maybe that happens further down the line. Maybe you're the hero that comes in and keeps the kingdom together until that happens further down the line. Who knows? We do know that they have at least one minor faction called the Company of the Golden Boar, and these guys are pretty much the poster child of like a mercenary company. There's not anything super unique to them. They're just out seeking glory and riches. But if you're looking for like a traditional mercenary experience, they are your go-to faction or sub-faction, minor faction, whatever. All right, and then one last faction before we get to the empire itself. So the ASERAI. They are the precursors to the Sarranids, and they are inspired by pre-Islam Arabs. Now, I don't know a ton about the history of this particular location during this particular period, so I'll give you what I can, but don't expect too much. Essentially, they are one of the, aside from the Battanians possibly, probably the earliest influence that's being drawn in Bannerlord. It appears that they've taken some historical basis from as early as like the 600s up to I think about the 900s to 1000 AD, so on the very early end of the range I gave you earlier, if not well before that. And the reason they've done this is because post-Islam, the territories or the areas that would have been occupied by these guys were then held by Islamic caliphates. And so I think Tailworld's reasoning was that they were a little bit too close to the empire that they were trying to focus on, and they didn't want to draw attention away from that. So instead they focused on the tribes that were there previously, but they did take some inspiration from the caliphates in terms of equipment so that this particular faction didn't look like it was pulled from earlier in time. They, of course, are in the southern deserts on the map, and they are led by Sultan Unkid, who appears to be a very interesting character. He's kind of all over the place in terms of his description. They've talked about bravery, skullduggery. Basically, you know, whatever he has to do to stay in power. He is an effective leader, but maybe not necessarily a benevolent one. And they specialize in skirmishers, very similar to the Serenids in Warband. Javelins on everything, whether it be on foot or on horseback. They love their javelins. They also are often going to carry spears and short swords. They have two minor factions, the Jawal, who are, I think, similar to Desert Raiders. There are Desert Raider bandits in the game, but I think these are slightly more focused ones, maybe more on the mercenary side. And then we have the Gilman, who are precursors to the Mamluks. So sort of like the slave soldiers that we see in Warband or in actual history. So some interesting groups there. I wish I knew more about this particular area and history, but that's all I've got for you guys, unfortunately. So moving on, we get to the main attraction here, which is the CALRADIANS, or the Calradian Empire. So they, of course, have no associations with anything in Warband. By that point, the empire is completely dissolved. Their main inspiration is the Byzantine Empire, although they do seem to pull here and there from earlier periods in Roman history. So I think that's more in character influence than faction influence, but it's difficult to say for sure. They are, of course, occupying the center portion of the map because they're, you know, effectively three large factions that make up one bigger faction. Their leader, at least until the beginning of the game, was Emperor Orenikos. He is dead. Whether he was assassinated or not isn't clear. What they tell us in the blog post was that after a campaign, he returned back to his palace and was complaining of a headache, asked to be left alone to rest, and was found later, several hours later, dead in a pool of his own blood. So whether or not somebody made him bleed to death, or whether it was something, maybe like he had an aneurysm and that was blood from his nose that caused him to die, we don't know. We just know that he's dead, and that has split the empire and left it in utter disarray. We'll get to that in a second, though. So they specialize in combined arms. They aren't the best at any one type of combat, but their strength is that they are very good, or like average to very good at all forms. So they have good heavy infantry, they have good heavy cavalry, they have good archers and crossbows. So they really don't have one particular strength, but I think their strength is in that they don't have any weaknesses. And so I think they'll be one of the easier factions to play, because as long as you sort of balance your army well and field it moderately effectively, you should be okay. They're not going to rely on you being, perfect in your deployment of your horse archers, or, making sure that your giant wall of heavy infantry isn't completely unflankable. As long as, again, you're, somewhat careful and you have a balanced army, I think with these guys you should be able to do all right. And so, as I said, with the Emperor's death, the Calradian Empire has split into three. Now, based on the language that they've used in the blog post, I am going to say that they are actively at war with each other at the start of the game. It's not immediately clear. They don't expressly state that that's the case, but it's more or less implied that they are actively fighting at this point. And so we'll get into those three factions now. The first of which, in no particular order, is going to be what I'm going to call the military party. So this party is focused around General Garios. He is one of essentially the three candidates for the Emperor's throne, the now unoccupied throne. He's a popular war hero, the victor of several campaigns, and he's backed by the Empire's military. So at the time of the Emperor's death, he was out on the Battanian frontier actively fighting, and it's also said that he has successfully won campaigns against the ASERAI. So he's been sort of off in the like the western part of the empire, conducting various campaigns. And so the reason I say he's possibly the North or the West party, we don't know for sure which one of these parties is sort of correlating to which, group on the map. They haven't, exactly told us. But they have given us some information I think can allow us to figure it out. So the reason I say North Party is because it does say that he's on the Battanian frontier. If we refer back to the map, we can see that the Northern Party does share a border with Battanian territory, so potentially that could be a Battanian frontier. But the Western does as well. So it's difficult to say based on that. We do know that he was campaigning against the ASERAI at some point too. I think it's safe to assume that that was a different campaign and not the same one, but we can see that the only parts of the empire that share any border with the ASERAI would be the Western and the Southern. This isn't a ton to go on, which is why I have both listed here, but I'm leaning more toward the West, which is why I've colored this party in line with the Western on the map. Now, if we move on to the next party, I think it'll shed a little bit more light on why I've made that decision. So this is the Senatorial Party, or at least that's what I'm calling it. That's because they're led by Senator Lucan. He's a very powerful politician, essentially the leader of the Senate, and he's backed by the entire Senate, as well as the aristocracy. So like all the nobility, the rich people basically are with this guy. So it's said that they are centered after him calling a meeting at his base of power up in the north. Now, that's what they say, the north. That's a bit vague, which is why here I've said possibly the North Party. Because, again, we don't know for sure. The northern part of the empire, could be the north, but if we look at the western, it also does go fairly far north, too. So it's very difficult to say. Now, another reason I'm not entirely sure is because when we look at the history of the Empire, it's said that the Empire started somewhere between the Southern Sea and the Battanian Hills. So if we look at where the Battanians are now, and unfortunately you guys can't see my cursor, but the body of water just under the Empire but above the ASERAI that looks like a very large lake, that's the Southern Sea they're referring to. So the only part of the Empire that fits that description is the western part. Now, based on real-life history, the Senate in the Roman Empire lasted far longer than I think most people realize, although their power was severely diminished, if not completely non-existent. But they existed in the West for a lot longer than a lot of people realize. And so if they're going to draw from history, the Senate would remain in their base of power where, they had originally had that power, which would be the West. So I'm not entirely sure there, but again, with the wording that they use, it would imply north. So those two I'm not entirely sure about. However, if we move on to the last one, which is the Imperial Party, this one is led by Empress Regea, who is the wife of the dead emperor. She's also the mother of the dead emperor's daughter, Ira, or something like that. And so she is essentially the head of the imperial family now. I don't think she has any direct claim on the throne through inheritance. I don't know if any inheritance laws are applicable here, if they had any, and whether or not they would apply to her. I think her daughter has better claim than she does, but it seems like she's kind of taken this opportunity and run with it. We know that when the emperor died, he died at Lycaron, which is the city in purple. It's kind of hard to see. It's right under Calradic Empire, the words there, and just above where it says Southern. So if you look up, there's two town names in purple above Southern. One of them to the left is Lycaron, and that's where the emperor's palace was. That's where he died, and that's where his wife made her claim. So we can assume that her base of power is there and that she is making up the southern, or again, the eastern faction. So the other two have to be the west and north. My assumption is that the west is going to be the military under the general, and the north is going to be the Senate under the senator. But again, that's just speculation from what we know. Okay, so those are the three factions that will be vying for the throne. Again, based on the language they've used in the blog posts, I think it's safe to assume that they're going to be actively fighting one another. Initially, it wasn't clear as to whether or not they were maybe just three different parts of one large empire that were sort of like allied to one another that might eventually break away, but were otherwise, together. It seems very clear now that they are actively hostile toward one another and in open civil war. So I think that's going to make the start of the campaign a whole lot more interesting. It does, however, make me disappointed based on stuff I've mentioned in earlier videos, where I would have really liked to see each of the various sub-empire factions slightly differentiated. The North, for example, is sharing borders with different factions than the South and the West. So it would have been cool to see a little bit of inspiration in each of those. The West is fighting the VLANDIANS and the ASERAI, maybe the BATTANIANS, and they would need slightly different tactics, or maybe they would adopt the tactics of their enemy. Versus the South, who's dealing with the KHUZAITS and the ASERAIs, they're going to be dealing with a lot of enemy cavalry. They might adopt slightly different tactics, or again, enemy tactics. And so I would have liked to see some implementation of that. And as far as we can tell, there is none. I've shown other videos of this, but we've seen a lot of the troop trees for these factions, and for the Empire, there's only one. It's just Imperial. There's no Western Imperial. There's no Southern Imperial. It's just Imperial. So they're all going to be using the same units as far as we know now. But this is something that modders can fix, so I would really like to see Tailworlds do it. It's obviously not worth delaying the game over, though. So, it's something that, we as modders can pick up and tweak. But that is it for the factions. Obviously, we're done with the map, so that's going to pretty much wrap up this video. Hopefully, this has been informative. This is everything we know so far, at least as far as I'm aware. I do cover all the blog posts, so unless they've released some information outside of those, chances are I've seen it all. So if I missed anything, feel free to let me know in the comments below. If there's anything you'd like to know a little bit more about, I can try to help you out. So feel free to ask that as well. But I tried to fit everything in here, so there may not be anything more I can offer. But anyways, thank you guys so much for watching. I always have a great time discussing some Bannerlord with you. I really hope the game would release soon, but I'm not holding my breath on it or anything. Hopefully you're not either. But yeah, so thanks again for watching, and I will see you guys back here for the next video.